Thank you so much. It's a delight for me to be here for many reasons. One being you, of course, Bernard. We have been doing things together with our good friend Etienne Balibar as well for years, and I just love what you are bringing to this community, our Columbia community. The other, I was just so happy to meet you in person when I discovered that we share Glissant and Simone Weil. I thought, okay, my goodness, this is really someone I need to meet. I've written little things here and there on Glissant, considering him essentially a philosopher of translation, and having used the concept of opacity in that particular sense in relation to translation. So I'll be interested in your reading of opacity and cultural rights, obviously. And Simone Weil also. Simone Weil, it is not very well known in France in particular, that she has written against colonialism in directions that are very, very important. I mean, when she discovered colonialism, she mentioned that she discovered colonialism in around 1931 after the massacre, the French massacre in what was called then in Indochine, China. And ever since, she has written fiercely against colonialism, and I've been interested in those texts after I had been interested back then when I was still doing, I think, undergraduate work. I was interested in la pesanteur et la grâce, and then so yeah, that is something we share, and I'll be delighted to listen to you, to your presentation, to moderate this session. So I might say a few words after your presentation,
Great.
And then we'll just have a general conversation. Okay?
So I have a handout for everybody. We decided, because it's a lunch talk, that I would just sit and present a kind of horizontal spirit, or lateral, to refer to some of Professor Diana's work. I'll let that just go around. There are a few more. Okay. Well, thanks so much for coming today. I want to thank Professor Harcourt for the invitation and Professor Diana for moderating. It means really so much to me. And because we'll be talking a little bit about line 3, the line 3 pipeline, I just want to say this might only be to Abigail, the lawyers, but maybe aspiring lawyers, in kind of the history of critical legal studies that I often read. It's not always explicit in some of your work, but I hear some of the emphases on ethics, what I hear is ethics there, that it's quite nice for those of us involved in some of the anti-pipeline work to know that there's a place where there are lawyers or law students in the clinics defending some people. Is heartening, actually, even if we lose a lot of the struggles, which is what my talk today will be about, Édouard Glissant's right to opacity in practice. I want to start with the long quotation on your handout. Number 1, Glissant was really talking about the Old Testament and Homer's Odyssey. And he said, "I began wondering if we did not still need such founding works today, ones that would use a similar dialectics of rerouting, asserting, for example, political strength, but simultaneously the rhizome of a multiple relationship with the other, and basing every community's reasons for existence on a modern form of the sacred, which would be, all in all, the poetics of relation." In the summer of last year, I drove north for a few hours to join a gathering at the headwaters of the Mississippi River in rural northern Minnesota. I grew up along the Mississippi, and perhaps it was because of that connection, as much as any sense of political commitment or ethical responsibility, as much as any desire to participate in a social movement, that caused me to go to the river that day. in response to a call put out by the organization Honor the Earth. In any case, about 20 of us ended up at the Mississippi headwaters together, all part of overlapping groups that had protested the Line 3 pipeline, which then and now brings Alberta oil across northern Minnesota to Superior, Wisconsin, along the way crossing Anishinaabe lands held according to 19th century treaties, crossing Lake Superior's watershed, and crossing under the Mississippi River. Importantly, we were at the headwaters after our efforts to stop the pipeline had failed. It was, after all, a pipeline that Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, a Democrat, supported, just as he supported and activated the National Guard to quell protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. In rural Minnesota, people both for and against the pipeline had hoped that Line 3 would not become another Standing Rock. The supporters, meaning that the pipeline would be renovated quickly and without event. The water protectors, meaning that it could be stopped and stopped without state violence. My thought along the river that morning was that it certainly wasn't Standing Rock. Again, there were only about 20 of us there, and I didn't see anyone from the media. For a while, we stood in a circle in silence. Then a few Anishinaabe men played the drums. Some of us exchanged names, and then we left. Since that day, I have often reflected on what we were doing there, our efforts so futile, our gathering so fleeting. And I have largely been left at a loss, until I returned to the Martinican poet and philosopher Édouard Glissant's book, Treatise of the All World, in which he describes opacity, his term for cultural difference, and part of what he would demand in calling for a right to opacity, in highly unusual terms. He says about opacity, let it be a ceremony. But as is his fashion, Glissant does not elaborate on what he means by the right to opacity as a ceremony. And it sounds strange to talk about human rights, whose traditional field is the United Nations or the International Courtroom, as a ceremony. Perhaps it makes more sense to talk about cultural difference that way, as when we hear calls to celebrate difference. And maybe Glissant means that, but he also certainly means much more than that. So as usual with his key concepts, it is up to us to gain a sense of it together and to live it out. For some help in doing so, in this talk I am going to thank the Jamaican philosopher and Black Studies scholar Sylvia Wynter, and in part because we're at Columbia, I'll take a brief detour through Edward Said and Wael Halak's debate on secularism and religion. And then, now reading through the lens of Wynter, Said, and Halak, I'll return to Glissant, ultimately trying to flesh out a little more about how an approach to difference and a claim to rights could be a ceremony. In her 1984 article, The Ceremony Must Be Found, After Humanism, Sylvia Wynter criticizes contemporary academic modes of knowledge. As we increase in our specialization, she says, our knowledge of the world and our place in it recedes. Before she calls for a new approach to knowledge, she traces how we got to our current mode of self-understanding as a species. For her, two pivotal moments were Renaissance humanism and the emergence of liberalism as tied to capitalist economics. Then, introducing a new form of study, she writes, and this is quote 2 on your handout, the studia must be reinvented as a higher order of human knowledge, able to provide an outer view which takes the human, rather than any one of its variants, as a subject. This outer view, she goes on, would allow us to attain the position of an external observer at once inside and outside of our order. That is, a position looking from the outside and looking at behaviors that guide human life in the present. The promise of this outer view for Wynter is that it offers a new space for us to remake ourselves again. And in a 2015 book chapter entitled The Ceremony Found, Wynter revisits her 1984 essay, now contextualizing the earlier piece as, quote, written in the lingering afterglow of what had been the dazzling if brief, cognitively emancipatory hiatus that had emerged in the wake of the social uprisings of the 1950s and 60s. End quote. The problem of Renaissance humanism, she says in that chapter, was to institute a division between Western humans, understood as a political animal, and, quote, all other humans now classified and subordinated as the West's ostensible irrational human others. Thus, from the beginning of humanism, the human was in fact not a universal category, but a negation of our co-humanity as a species. Liberal humanists would make a similar division between Western economic man and the racialized other. In other words, Wynter teaches us, both Renaissance and liberal humanisms offered a negation of humanity, presenting a sense of the human, yes, but also defining clearly what was not human in terms of what was not Western, using the concept of race to divide our species. As Wynter explains, quote, secularization thus concurrently established the modern racial order while it decentered medieval Christendom. Indeed, the question of the secular becomes the focus of Wynter's second essay on the ceremony. The price paid for Western humanism, both Renaissance and liberal, she concludes, is the aporia of the secular, in which we have a humanly emancipatory process on the one hand and a humanly subjugating process on the other. And what might solve this aporia, she suggests, is the ceremony she had been looking for in the first place, the ceremony that crosses the color line. It is noteworthy that one of Wynter's examples of differing observer positions, or the outer view, from the 1984 essay, is Edward Said's Orientalism. And Said, although born to Palestinian parents and so not a product of the interracial ceremony Wynter starts from, lived in exile as part of the Palestinian diaspora, and so lived from an outer view regarding his own nation as well as regarding the West, feeling always out of place, as he put it in the title to his memoir. There are other reasons it is perhaps not surprising that Wynter would turn to Said for this outer view. Both share key influences in Vico and Foucault, and both share the project of trying to think through and unsettle the colonial problematic they were living through. Perhaps most importantly to this talk, both Wynter and Said are humanists. They understood and indeed have taught many of us the limitations of the category of the human, but they ultimately maintained a sense of species being in their criticism. And so I want to follow Wynter's lead in turning next to Said's articulation of secular criticism, here raising a question. When Wynter says that Renaissance humanism offered a new secular as an answer to who we are as humans, and that she will follow that answer, but also emphasizes that we are living through the underside costs of the aporia of the secular West, including how most of us are now guided by a secular metaphysics of productivity and profitability. Is she ultimately following or departing from secularism? Reading Said will help us gain clarity on Wynter's position. Said calls his introduction to his 1983 book, The World, the Text, and the Critic, secular criticism. Before he defines his terms, he contextualizes his intervention within the U.S. Academy, writing not in regard to new studies, as Wynter called them, but making a similar point about specialization and provincialism in regard to literature, criticism, and the humanities more broadly. The whole edifice of humanistic knowledge, resting on the classics of European letters, Said says, represents only a fraction of the real human relationships and interactions now taking place in the world. New cultures, new societies, and emerging visions of social, political, and aesthetic order now lay claim to the humanist's attention, he goes on, with an insistence that can no longer be denied. When he does finally get around to talking about the secular, he says he is interested in how the political and social world becomes available for critical and secular scrutiny. He adds that secular criticism deals with local and worldly situations, and that it is constitutively opposed to the production of massive heretic systems. This is a point he makes within a larger point about form, arguing that the essay, a comparatively short, investigative, radically skeptical form, is the best form for secular criticism. And he summarizes his main point, quote, criticism must think of itself as life-enhancing and constitutively opposed to every form of tyranny, domination, and abuse. Its social goals are non-coercive knowledge, produced in the interest of human freedom, unquote. For Said, then, secular criticism leverages the big concepts that some would rather deconstruct, such as the human and freedom. What is secular about it is its focus on this human level, its focus on engaging the world and not just making metaphysical claims, or just staying within the text when we theorize. This sense of secularity is brought into further relief in his conclusion to that book, Religious Criticism, in which he describes the religious tendency, this is quote 3 on your handout, as an agent of closure, shutting off human investigation and effort in deference to the authority of the more than human, the supernatural, the otherworldly. So, for Said, if a religious approach gives us group solidarity and communal belonging, it can also compel subservience and adherence. Indeed, Said saw religiosity not just in writing about holy texts and theology, but also in those versions of such actively radical positions as Marxism, feminism, or psychoanalysis that stress the private and hermetic over the public and the social. He goes on to say that this new mood superficially resembles, but is very unlike, the utopianism of Ernst Bloch. Resembles, for its turn, to the religious, with a view toward solving social problems, but unlike because of instead of returning from the religious to everyday reality, as Bloch did, religious critics offer only, quote, theory liberated from the human. All of it, Said summarizes, I'm quoting, expresses an ultimate preference for the secure protection of systems of belief and not for critical activity or consciousness. He goes as far as to say, and these are the concluding lines to that book, that the critic has become a cleric, and the most important task of the day is returning criticism to a truly secular enterprise. This return is a corrective in that a secular refocus returns us to a sense of history and a sense of human production. So, reading Wynter with Said, we see that their ultimate concern is that we are telling ourselves stories about who we are that place our agency outside of ourselves, or that take away from ourselves an ability to tell different stories and thus to remake the world. But importantly, how they go about making this point, if it shares a content, departs significantly in form. When Said writes in The World, the Text, and the Critic 1 year before Wynter's first article on the ceremony, that, quote, having given up the world entirely for the aporias and unthinkable paradoxes of a text, contemporary criticism has retreated from its constituency, the citizens of modern society, who have been left to the hands of free market forces, multinational corporations, and the manipulations of consumer appetites. It is as if, for me, he is summarizing some of my frustrations with the jargon-heavy and esoteric style of both of Wynter's essays on the ceremony. Form aside, it was not just Said's criticism that was more secular than Wynter's, in the sense that I have been using the term. His life was also more secular in the colloquial sense. Even if by secular criticism, Said does not mean criticism of religious institutions per se, and even if some readers of Said have read his secularism primarily as a critique of nationalism or as a critique of metaphysics and transcendence, Said certainly would and did criticize those religious institutions. Born and having spent summers in Jerusalem, he was always wary of the tensions created by competing claims to religious significance and the violence that often followed from those disagreements. But to disregard religion as a source of knowledge, tradition, and guidance is indeed to throw away much of human experience. In his book on Said and religion, the scholar of religious studies William Hart said that on this point, Said demonstrated a lack of insight because religion is an important site of struggle. It is more important, Hart went on, joking, than Western classical music for the elaboration of civil society and as a form of ideology critique. And in his striking critique of Said in the book Restating Orientalism, the philosopher Wael Halak goes as far as to say that Said's liberalism and secularism, including his apprehension about religion, prevented a true critique of historical efforts at domination and sovereignty. For Halak, it is ultimately religion that allows what Wynter called an outer view, meaning that the role of religion is to allow humans to reevaluate our place in the world and who we are, including recognizing that sovereignty is a concept that belongs only to God, never to a human as a property owner, and never to a nation state as a political unit. What is needed, Halak goes on, is an inversion of the entire value structures of modernity, amounting to a revolution not only against how we think, but more importantly against who we as humans ultimately are. Integral to this revolution, he concludes, and this is quote 4 on your handout, is a major adjustment geared toward compelling us initially and until it becomes ingrained in us as a second nature to see the world as a unity. And this cannot be successfully undertaken without realizing the full potential of our capacities of love, sympathy, and solidarity, capacities that may reestablish the desideratum of harmony within life and the world. So here I want to propose a paradoxical question, but one I take very seriously. If, as Wynter noted, one of the exports of the modern West has been secularization, and if Wynter is searching for a new secular, which she defines carefully as fundamentally meaning otherness, as well as coming from the world and not the church, in the realm of fallen time and not the transcendent realm of divine time, then might we find this new secular not in the clergy or the clerics, not in search of a transcendent or divine realm, but in the natural world around us that is very much in time, that grows and passes away, that changes and dies and begins again. And here's the paradox. Isn't it different forms of human religion that, in passing down natural law, have emphasized this point most consistently? This is a question resonant with how Ernst Bloch, to return to Said's citation of Bloch, connected natural law to justice, writing, quote, ethical freedom, where it appears, is not formed in tranquility, but precisely as a character in the river of the world. If in reading Glissant's novels, Wynter finds promise in a character who learned to study not only that which lies around him, but that inside him, as he leaves behind the certainty of the transcendental for the provisional. If, in other words, Wynter ultimately comes down on the side of human autonomy over an understanding of the earth as something like transcendental, I would still underscore that, as mystics from various traditions have emphasized, a study of the divine through the natural can remain very much uncertain, very much provisional, open, and ambiguous, as we try to learn from what some have called creation around us. So my question becomes, could we, in studying this cosmological and earthly law, a kind of law beyond law, could we find the grounds for a worldly utopian or concrete utopian vision? What Professor Diane has called a lateral universal. And if we could, How could we make that vision public and legible and widely shared and informed by those we are in dialogue with, while emphasizing our agency within that vision? In calling for new founding works today, Glissant looks to the models of the Old Testament and the Odyssey, among others. And in closing, I want to suggest, perhaps, that one base for what he calls a modern form of the sacred, what he calls a poetics of relation, might not be found in a book. We might first look with others to read the reality of the world that surrounds us. This way of following law beyond law might start to look less like acting out of fear of a forceful sovereign, and more like an aesthetic practice, similar to contemplating a painting or listening to a waterfall. The struggle over the Line 3 pipeline both was and was not the conflict of two laws, to borrow the phrase Bloch used to describe Antigone. It was not because there was a conflict over only one law, namely US law, and specifically interpretations of an 1837 treaty between the US government and the Anishinaabe people. The treaty specifies Anishinaabe rights to hunt, fish, and harvest wild rice, and in the 1999 US Supreme Court case, Minnesota v. Mille Lacs Band of Chippewa, the court affirmed the 1837 treaty rights. Last summer, some Anishinaabe argued that Line 3 violates these treaty rights because the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources granted a permit to the pipeline company Enbridge to draw water from wild rice beds, to use the water, and to return the now contaminated water to other places. So the potential pipeline spills, in addition to that water, could and would and has poisoned the treaty-bound land and water. Our ceremony at the Mississippi headwaters, like so many indigenous-led protests and prayers across Turtle Island in the century, called for the treaties to be honored. And for this reason, we were calling not so much for a critique of, as for the actual affirmation of positive law. But there was also a second law at play in the struggle over Line 3. The second law at play at our river gathering was what we could call a natural law, whether it be the metaphysics of different Abrahamic faiths that were present even at our small gathering, or whether it be informed by an Anishinaabe understanding of creation, which includes a first man who performed a naming ceremony and gave us language, as well as a co-creating thunderbird who ties human capabilities to ancestors and reminds us that birds are connections to both our spiritual hearts and to the universe. Although in terms of what Glissant called a right to opacity, this creation story and metaphysics remain very much opaque to me. In the same terms, we at the Headwaters chose to defend not just the treaty rights, but also the cultural rights of the Anishinaabe. Rights to difference, rights which are deeply tied to the wild rice and the river and the land, because culture and land are not separated according to the second higher law. So according to the first law, the positive law of the treaties, our ceremony doesn't really make sense. Our reading of the 1837 treaty was not upheld in the practice of the state, and we were not at the river only to mark this failure or to mourn our loss. After all, if we gathered only amidst discrete political struggles, only to achieve one policy victory at a time, then we would not have gathered at the river at all, for we had already lost this specific struggle. No, we were there as part of what Wynter calls the long process of humanity. Our ceremony crossed the color line, but we were not simply subjects. We were trying not just to study, but to receive the lessons of the water, and to do so publicly, no matter how small our gathering was. We were taking an outer view on our still modern order, not just from multiple cultures, but also from the perspective of the river and the transitions it was teaching us. My sense is that if we are to defend human rights beyond separate struggles, between the performances of Occupy and Standing Rock and Cop City and those that have recently shut down Grand Central Station here, then we might follow the rules of Standing Rock: no drugs, no weapons, dress simply, not just at the event, but throughout our lives, because the water and the birds teach us that the world is a unity and that everywhere is a prayer camp, but we have covered over that relational sacred. If this is a practice that acknowledges the extra human, it is also one that situates the human into a cosmos much bigger than ourselves. We could think of this ultimately as undermining humanism. We could read it as an acknowledgement that we're abandoning our agency, our ability to tell a new story. But for me, situating human life as relative to an earthly order much bigger than us is better understood as affirming precisely the conditions that make our agency possible in the river of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ben, for this wonderful presentation of opacity, Glissant's opacity, but so rich also with everybody, especially our own colonial people, while Halak and Edouard Said, of course, thank you for that. I will just share a remark with you before and have a reaction to my remark before we open it. Since you mentioned my notion of lateral universal, which is first Merleau-Ponty. I'm associated now with lateral universal for having worked it out from Merleau-Ponty. And the very first time I met Édouard Glissant, that was what I presented when he invited me to give a lecture at the Institut du Tout Monde in Paris. That was actually the very year when he died. I mean, I not expected, of course, but those are the months where I was in contact with him through our mutual friend François Nudelman, who was running the institute then. And he invited me to talk about my notion of universal. He was kind of, because he was very wary of the word universal. He did not like the word universal, even lateral. So he, so he wanted me to present on that, and we discussed it. And the reason why, as you know, he did not like so much the word universal was precisely because for him, it went against the right to opacity. Universalism, the universal is always the universal of somebody, and the imperial universal in a way, and embodied in this notion of the West having reached some transparency to itself, and then being just legitimate in sending out all these translators, all these anthropologists who are going to find out about the rest of the world and translate the rest of the world in the language of the West for the West. So that is what he had in mind, and this is exactly why he insisted also so much on opacity. There is something untranslatable. You cannot just translate us for consumption of the center, of the periphery by the center. But, and this is where I would like you to comment, he also insisted very much on the concept that goes often in his writing with opacity. I think he thinks in terms of the couple of concepts, opacity and relation. Opacity being associated with relation. That is to say, the right of opacity is still the affirmation of relation. And comes to my mind a quote from him when he talks about l'opacité ouverte, des existences non réductibles, the open opacity of non-reducible existences. So opacity, yes, but opacity open towards relation. And I mentioned this because what I was arguing after our discussion at the Institut du Monde, and when we had lunch or dinner with Francois and himself, was that what I tried to pursue with the notion of lateral universality, lateral universality, was precisely this notion of open opacity and so I want you to be a kind of referee between between us, given the use of the concept of opacity in your own work here. That's really the remark I had for you.
Thank you. I think it matters to me that he situated opacity in a rights claim so often, where a lot of contemporary readings of Glissant and opacity just talk about opacity. And he does, talk about that in a number of places. But I think another way of, or what I hear, could just be me, as resonant with the open opacity is a right to opacity. Because by making a rights claim, you're already engaging in politics, you're already engaging in connections with histories that have made rights claims, as he certainly is, as I read him, but as well as current struggles that might start from rights claims. And so for me, that phrasing, which which is in Caribbean discourse, but it's also in the last philosophy of relation, and all over throughout the theoretical work, is evidence that there's more than just a claim to, however we want to call it, the irreducible element. That there's also that relational element that's political. I don't know how else to say it. That because it could have been other, cultural opacity, or he could have framed it in many other ways. So I sort of wonder, why the rights claim? And that is my initial thought of it. It also doesn't get into metaphysical worries or something. It seems it could be lateral.
Mm-hmm. So you reconcile us. Okay, thanks. Floor is open.